The change that I feel could improve a masterwork like The Last of Us the most, and even more so the sequel, would be to give players a choice. After all, that's what really sets games apart as a storytelling medium, the possibility that different outcomes can arise directly from the player's decision making. Imagine the intriguing moral quandaries that could result from even a very limited number of difficult, late game choices here. Save the child or don't. Stay with your brother or leave his community. And perhaps most critically, take your revenge or don't. Welcome, greetings all. My name is Dr. Brian Methods. I have a PhD in English literature, I'm a published novelist, and my channel focuses mostly on classic literature. But recently I've been branching out into pop culture too. I've always intended to make a video about the superlative gaming experience that was The Last of Us, but, well, I was in no great hurry. I was planning to probably slot it in somewhere after my Anna Karenina video. But the sequel's out and proving decidedly divisive. I'll probably never make a video wholly about The Last of Us 2, because I don't think I'll play it to the depth I like to play games I'm going to review. Generally for PlayStation games I like to at least get a platinum trophy. But hearing a number of different reviews made me want to talk about the first game, and the questions I think it's set up in storytelling terms that I would have liked to have seen explored in a hypothetical sequel. And that made me put together a script for this video with alacrity. What? Yes, of course that's a real word. Now, before we go any further, I do try to be oblique, but I will be spoiling plot elements of both The Last of Us games. So, be forewarned, ye who enter here. Suffice it to say, I loved The Last of Us. It's one of the very few games I bought again when they upgraded it slightly for a new console generation. Its gameplay was repetitive, sure, and not really a challenge until Survivor mode, but the story, characters, and graphics really drew me in, and every episode on the journey Joel and Ellie take has stuck with me. I will unabashedly defend it from detractors, and even though I'm in all probability the kind of person who comes off as a total total snob when it comes to high art, I will without a modicum of hesitation defend the position that games can indeed be art. And as with Undertale, the only other video game I've talked about on this channel so far, the narrative is central to that. One of the things I always do on this channel, whether I'm talking about Jane Eyre or Himeji Castle, is to establish the historical context in which a piece of art gained prominence. The Last of Us was very much the right game at the right time. It was released in the summer of 2013 for the PlayStation 3, and had been in development since 2009 at its studio, Naughty Dog. It really built on the groundwork laid down by that studio's first two Uncharted games, which in turn were influenced by similar action-adventure games like the Resident Evil series, going back to Tomb Raider, or even Alone in the Dark. By the time The Last of Us came out, this style of game was very well established, where the player navigates a character through environments in the third person, taking out adversaries either stealthily or using weapons, often seeking cover for safety, collecting items, or solving puzzles to get to the next area and advance the story. From Assassin's Creed to Batman Arkham Asylum, this playstyle was and is by no means a rarity. As influences, creative director Neil Druckmann, who right now is the centre of the swirling maelstrom of hot takes the new game has elicited, cited the playstyle of Ico, a setting like Night of the Living Dead, and a main character reminiscent of Hartigan from Sin City. Concurrently, The Last of Us was released as games became increasingly narrative-driven and cinematic. The likes of BioShock, Heavy Rain, and Spec Ops: The Line had raised expectations for how sincerely and realistically a story could be conveyed, while striving towards blending the feeling of watching a movie with the thrill and personal involvement of controlling a character. The Walking Dead explored more of how a zombie game could have a deep emotional resonance and focus on characters. Then of course, Sonic 2006 had established the true wonder and spectacle of a supremely polished game. Maybe ignore that last one. But yes, built upon everything that had come before it, The Last of Us was like a polished figurehead added on the prow of the ship that was the PS3 catalogue. Right at the beginning, when the console launched, we weren't so sure she would stay afloat. But by this release, it was a fine, well-balanced vessel indeed. The Last of Us was also not a remake, not a sequel, not the latest in a long line of games established back when they were throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. And with the possible exception of more varied kill animations, it had everything a gamer could hope for. Cutting-edge graphics for an aging console, a strong atmosphere, a purposely restricted but still fluid control scheme that made the characters feel real and not like superhumans, even as they walk off several bullets to the head. Traditional shuffling zombies with a fungal twist, superb, completely committed vocal performances, sound design that was elegantly minimal, matched with tasteful, memorable music, and then of course, the narrative itself. Joel has to get his 12-year-old daughter Sarah out of the house. They've had a good day together, it was his birthday after all, but now the neighbour is acting like a crazed madman. Joel had to shoot him dead. The news is reporting a strange outbreak of some sort. Austin has descended into chaos, even more so than usual, and in the end it turns out not to be the infected Joel needs to worry about the most, but the military. 20 years later, he can't forgive himself for losing his daughter that night. He's a jaded, hardened mercenary now, part of a small-scale smuggling operation in the remnants of a society that just barely hangs together. Infected are everywhere, ready to attack any humans they see. Or, if the infection has claimed their eyes, here, a bite turns you into one of them if they don't rip you apart first, and so do fungal spores released into the air. It's a brutal world, when weapons are stolen from Joel and his badass partner Tess. There's no question they're going to execute the one who did it. Life is cheap in this world. Everything changes when Joel takes on the job of smuggling a teenage girl to the Fireflies, a group that has organized to resist the excessively authoritarian government. But when they reach the meeting point, there's nobody alive to meet them. Tess is critically injured, and the little girl, Ellie, gets bitten. But she doesn't turn. She's immune. Urged by a dying Tess and remembering his own daughter, Joel decides to help get Ellie to where she needs to be. It's a long road, and along the way they meet an incredibly memorable cast in distinct episodes, some of whom they seek out and some of whom they meet by chance. The brothers who care so deeply for each other, Henry and Sam. The grisly survivalist, Bill, who just happens to be gay, or possibly bi or another sexuality that drew him to guys. We shouldn't erase those possibilities. Then there was the horribly creepy cannibal David, because by no means all the people they meet are going to want to help. Through a charming DLC episode, we also learn more of Ellie's past and how she came to find out she was immune, as well as exploring her feelings for another girl. Diversity was, I feel, done so well in this game, with representation for a broad spectrum of people that was believable in the way the protagonist and deuteragonist reacted, had its own unique voice, and never felt artificial. The cast of the sequel has a similar admirable diversity, but perhaps excepting Lev, unfortunately can only offer a relative paucity of character-defining moments or interesting quirks that made us connect to the characters in the first game, even though we meet them only for a very short time each. At the end of the journey, Joel has to make a somewhat predictable but still highly affecting decision. The player doesn't get a choice in this matter. Forced to weigh Ellie's life against a possibility for a cure, as well as the possibility his actions will result in losing both, Joel makes the decision he feels is right, but the player is left pondering just how correct his actions were. This journey across a harrowing, fractured country is punctuated by numerous moments of brightness. Joel beginning to open up to Ellie, and their roles swapping so that she has to care for him when he's in his moment of greatest need. Bad jokes and taking a toy for Sam's benefit, or pretending to wonder why a certain magazine has sticky pages. Then of course the lows resonate with us profoundly, seeing the hopelessness in Henry's eyes after he does what he has to do, and then in moments realizes he can't live with it. Stumbling across a makeshift kindergarten in the tunnels and piecing together the aftermath through the pieces of writing left behind. But then when reprieve comes, oh, it feels good. And what more do I need to say than giraffes? So many players grew to love these characters, and for 7 years they wondered what would happen after Joel's decision. And that brings us to this. I'm not going to just rip into The Last of Us 2. Critics loved it and a lot of players hated it. Some players really liked it, of course, Donkey for one. For me, I'm probably going to remember it as a museum trip with dinosaurs and cowboy hats DLC, plus some other stuff. Stuff which I honestly consider to be squandering an amazing level of potential. Every narrative is a set of storytelling decisions, and it's perfectly fine to make the less obvious choices that you think will tell a more provocative and interesting story. Art is certainly allowed to challenge and provide new experiences. I mean, there's an argument to be made that that's the teleological purpose of creating good art. But to follow one idea is inevitably to lose the chance to explore another. My feeling is that in a world where life is taken so easily, a story about breaking the cycle of revenge is both an unsuitable and pretty ordinary one. It's also not very satisfying given the rest of the narrative. You can't break that cycle at the end of a journey, absolutely surf it with acts that can and should lead to a whole slew of new people out for revenge on Ellie. I don't find it satisfying to have the character take some kind of moral high ground with her decision in the final moments of the game, when the antagonist we're meant to come around to understand got her complete revenge and doesn't seem like she'll have to live the rest of her life tortured by the consequences of her actions, acknowledging of course that she is responsible for the deaths of almost everybody she cares for, indirectly. As I said at the start of the video, perhaps at the very least giving players a choice could have given more people a sense of a completed story, just as it would have been an intriguing possibility at the end of the original game, though being dragged into a morally ambiguous decision of course has its own merits, and I appreciate that this would undermine the message the writers are trying to convey. I simply feel like the idea of revenge taking its toll on Ellie was explored, albeit in a very open-ended way, but there's very little acknowledgement that Abby's choice to take revenge could also have culminated in the same hesitation and ultimately forgiveness. Why doesn't Abby have Ellie's story, or at the very least, why is her doing what Ellie does not something we see having a similar effect on her? Let's talk about what else could have been explored in the sequel, from my perspective as a storyteller at least. Firstly, we could have had more of an exploration of what the authoritarian government did since the first game, and how the infection has affected the rest of the world. The government's presence fades over the course of the first game, but the beginning makes it clear that they are still a powerful presence, and it seems unlikely they would just collapse and effectively evaporate while other organised groups thrive. Joel, after all, lost Sarah to them, and lived for decades opposing them. Perhaps when she found out what Joel did, Ellie could try and present herself to those authorities, only to have that drive more of a wedge between her and her father figure, with the game leading towards reconciliation and the question of whether the government has any interest in helping someone like Ellie. I feel the moral conundrum at the end of the first game bore much more exploration too. In the sequel, Ellie finds out Joel lied to her, and she is the only one who's immune, that they know of at least. The Fireflies wanted to kill her to try, and the game probably ought to stress more that this was no certain thing, to make a vaccine and save humanity, but Joel prevented that. All Ellie does with this information is get stroppy with Joel for a while, then carries on her new life. Should she not be motivated to try and help humanity again now that she knows she probably is the only one with immunity? However, immunity to fungal infection works. It's poorly understood by modern medicine. The premise that Abby's dad is the only human being anywhere capable of doing whatever procedure he intended to do to make a cure seems risible, even if Ellie did come across that information. I feel that more focus on the effects of the estrangement of the main characters would have been very compelling, even if Joel does end up dying at the hands of someone who wants revenge on him for one of his many past misdeeds. Killing him off very early because he lacks caution around a large group, then attempting to show the killer's side of the story, is far more frustrating than it is revelatory in storytelling terms. Does it shock the player and make them question conventional sequel storytelling? Maybe. But does it also drastically disappoint them, disconnect them from the narrative, and make them wonder about the myriad other possibilities they would have preferred? Certainly. Does the game do enough to justify the decision to focus on his killer, a completely new character, and why she does what she does? In my opinion, it does not. The Abby section of this game is inadequate to make her sufficiently sympathetic so that we actually want to care for her. I do understand the desire not to pander. I certainly would have liked to have seen Bill again in the second game, but I understand how that could be seen as vapid fan service. But equally, the first game was unafraid of being predictable, with familiar tropes executed extremely well. Tess got to go out in a blaze of glory. Wouldn't it be nice for Joel to get that too? Could we not have seen a story centered on the main characters reconciling in a crisis for their community, or guiding a new recruit potentially being betrayed by them, so that Joel has to question whether opening up was wise after all? What if they found out there were others with immunity, but they have to be skeptical in case they're a fraud? I grant you some of these ideas might come out cheesy, but surely they're better than a story that at its heart could be told in any setting, in any medium, with any interchangeable characters. Any character can go on a quest for revenge after seeing a loved one killed, slaughter everyone involved except the one who actually did it, then go home. I mean, yes, it would be a radical shift in tone for Peppa Pig, but it's at least feasible. Does anything about the scenario presented require the world of The Last of Us, or get informed by it in some way? Does it need to be told through the medium of a game, or get in any way enhanced by being told this way over the length of a 20+ hour experience? And is denying the catharsis of revenge really that bold and clever? We're all very familiar with the idea that revenge is usually a bad thing and has negative effects on the one exacting it. Nobody reads The Count of Monte Cristo and doesn't at least stop to wonder if the Count should have prevented little Edouard de Villefort's death during his quest for revenge. But at the same time, this isn't as disproportionate as what happens to the Villeforts. Ellie taking a life in return for Joel's life doesn't seem disproportionate. It's what would happen inside pretty much any justice system in the world, acknowledging, of course, that Joel too is a mass murderer. Revenge stories are fundamentally cathartic, and denying that catharsis is less brave and thought-provoking than irritating, making the journey seem pointless as a whole. I understand they've gone for denying closure and seeking a different path, but it feels hypocritical given how Abby's quest for revenge gets completed, and more particularly how many others die and the cycle isn't in any way broken. Imagine Kill Bill if Bill gets to walk away. Imagine if at the end of John Wick, surrounded by the bodies of dead men with pencils sticking out of their eyes, John lets Theon Greyjoy Allen give him a lecture and run off. I understand that the writers might feel a certain triumph, that they evoked strong feelings of frustration thanks to this different choice from convention, but in my eyes at least, causing the player or reader to be irritated isn't a hallmark of good storytelling. You can irritate people just by randomly stopping them. I ended up ranting, huh? I feel like the museum sequence in The Last of Us 2 dangles in front of us what could have been, though of course a game with nothing but that kind of indulgence wouldn't have been particularly engaging. But several steps back in the direction of actually pleasing the audience and not forcing them to do things they simply don't want to do would have helped immeasurably. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. If you've watched this far, thank you so very much, and I'd love to hear what you thought in the comments down below. With that though, see you next time.